Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to break down the huge 15-year economic story that has completely shaped the world we're living in right now. It's a story all about stimulus, wild consequences, and a really dramatic, painful reversal that, let's be honest, we're all feeling.
So let's start with this pretty stark warning from the head of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, back in August of 2022. He was talking to the world's top economists, so you know he chose his words very, very carefully. And one word in particular really jumped out.
Pain. Just that one word. And it sent absolute shockwaves through the financial world. It was the signal that the age of easy money, it was officially over.
And make no mistake, this wasn't an accident. This was a deliberate, calculated promise of economic hardship. It was a radical change of course after more than a decade of doing the exact opposite.
So that brings us to the big question, right? Why? Why was all this pain suddenly necessary? What kind of problem had gotten so big that the only solution was to purposely slam the brakes on the economy? Well, to get that, we have to go back to the beginning. The pain Powell was talking about. Think of it like a really nasty medicine for a specific disease, runaway inflation. We're talking about the fastest rise in prices the U.S. had seen in 40 years. But here's the thing, that inflation didn't just appear out of nowhere. It was actually a side effect of the cure for the last major crisis.
And to really see how this all builds, our story has to kick off back in 2008. The global financial system was in a state of absolute, total collapse, and the Federal Reserve was staring down the barrel of another Great Depression. As one former Fed official put it, the very arteries of the economy had just collapsed. So the Fed's first move was to slash interest rates basically down to zero. But when that wasn't enough, they unleashed a brand new, powerful, and honestly, highly experimental tool. They called it quantitative easing, or QE for short. Now I know, that sounds super complicated, but the core idea is shockingly simple. The Fed basically prints money digitally, and then uses that new money to buy financial assets, which floods the whole banking system with cash.
The whole concept was, well, almost like alchemy. The Fed was creating money from nothing. The hope was that by pumping it into the banks, they'd start lending again and, restart the heart of the economy. This whole thing was designed as an emergency measure for an emergency situation.
But here's where the story takes a major turn. What was supposed to be a short-term, break glass in case of emergency tool, well, it wasn't short-term at all. It ended up becoming the defining policy for the next 10 years, and it came with some really profound and, frankly, unintended consequences.
You see, the stated goal was to help Main Street, to boost jobs, help out average people, but that's not really what happened. The river of new money didn't really flow into the real economy. Instead, it took a sharp turn and became a tidal wave for Wall Street, driving the prices of stocks and other assets to historic highs.
And this led to a simple but incredibly powerful mantra for a whole generation of investors. Don't fight the Fed. As long as the Fed was pumping trillions into the system, the markets basically had a safety net. Some people even started calling it a no-lose casino, where taking huge risks was always rewarded.
And here you can really see the deep distortions this created over time. First, the markets got addicted. In 2013, when the Fed just hinted at slowing down the money printer, the market threw a huge fit. They called it the taper tantrum. Second, wealth inequality just exploded, since all this new money lifted the yachts of people who owned assets way more than it helped regular wage earners. And finally, companies borrowed all this cheap money, but instead of investing in new factories or research, they often just used it to buy back their own stock, which artificially pumped up their share prices.
So for 10 years, the Fed was trying to slowly, carefully wean the economy off this powerful drug. But just as they were making a little bit of progress, a global shock hit that didn't just restart the whole experiment, it threw it into hyperdrive.
The response to the COVID-19 pandemic just dwarfed anything we had ever seen before. The Fed and the government unleashed trillions of dollars, and this time, a lot of it came in checks sent directly to Americans. As one Fed insider said, their strategy was brutally simple. Find any part of the market that's on fire and just dump money on it.
This massive, and I mean massive, overdose of stimulus created a speculative frenzy. With all this cash flooding the system, people poured money into everything from cryptocurrencies to meme stocks. The problem was you had way too much money chasing way too few goods because all the supply chains were broken. The result? The fuse for massive inflation was lit.
At first, the Fed wasn't too worried. They thought these price hikes were just a temporary blip caused by the pandemic, that it would all just fix itself. They even had a word for it, transitory. Well, they were wrong.
By late 2021, you just couldn't deny it anymore. Inflation wasn't going away. In fact, it was getting worse. The Fed, realizing it had made a big mistake, was forced into one of the most dramatic policy U-turns in its entire history.
They didn't just tap the brakes, they slammed on them. The era of easy money was over. The policy of quantitative easing was thrown into reverse, and it became quantitative tightening, or QT. So instead of printing money to buy assets, they started pulling that money out of the system. The goal was the exact opposite of what they'd been doing for a decade: make money more expensive and slow everything down.
And that brings us full circle, right back to the start. The Fed began raising interest rates at the fastest pace in 40 years. The goal wasn't to stimulate the economy anymore. It was to cool it down, to deliberately inflict that pain that Powell promised in order to crush inflation.
You know, the legendary investor Warren Buffett has a famous saying for moments exactly like this. For over a decade, the tide of easy money was rising, and it lifted all boats, from the most solid companies to the most speculative gambles.
Well, now that tide is finally going out. The great unwinding of the easy money experiment is happening right now, and we are only just beginning to see the consequences of a financial world that was built on a foundation of nearly free money for over a decade. The crucial question is, what's going to be exposed now that the water's gone?